Welcome back. Now, whether the COVID-19 pandemic has an exit timeline or not, we must recognize the fact that no business has been spared from the negative implications of the coronavirus as the world continues to grapple with the economic contractions and volatility. The pandemic has dealt a blow globally on small and medium enterprises, a situation that has led to currency pressures, pay cuts or job cuts, increase in unemployment rate, the high jump in inflation, and declines in purchasing power. While entrepreneurs struggle to stay afloat with hopes that the pandemic will soon fizzle away, business and risk analysts seem to hold some solutions to the questions of their ventures. Christian Wilson, a consultant at business advisory firm Spirit, joins us now to share some recommendations on how to navigate the environmental headwinds in the country. Good morning. Thank you for joining us on the program. Now, let's hear your views on how the small and medium enterprises have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Hi. Okay. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay. It's great to be joining you. I think that there's actually been quite a huge variety in terms of how people have been affected by the pandemic. I think it's really a function of where you were placed at the industry level, how your company was configured. And so I think that you've seen quite a lot of resilience from some of these MSMEs who were super quick to adapt to many of the changes that the pandemic were bringing. Some were actually really good at anticipating because of what was happening in other countries, what was going to be happening in Nigeria, because as you know, we did move a little slower than other places in terms of how we managed the pandemic. So all in all, I think it's been quite a mixed reaction for MSME.
Now, well, what have you noticed in the ways and the means that the MSMEs have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic crisis?
So one of the things I've been quite impressed by has actually been the agility in terms of pivoting for a lot, especially small businesses. I think medium-sized businesses struggled a bit because they had much more complex processes that they needed to pivot. But I found that these micro and small businesses were very quick to capitalize on resources like WhatsApp, phone calls, and really sort of transition their businesses into more or less virtual and online businesses that they can deliver from everywhere. So I think in many ways, the sort of high level of informality in terms of the ways that many MSMEs do business, which is typically a challenge, right, to their own growth and their own scaling, in this particular case, help them to be very quick about the transition with the lockdown, things like curfews and not being able to move things quickly around. There's also, of course, the way in which delivery logistics and how anybody and everybody was, buying a motorcycle and making sure that deliveries could get from one part of the city to another, helped to speed things up as well. So if you think about the fact that our FMCG sector is one of our biggest sectors, and then of course during COVID-19, when people couldn't move around as much, you're seeing at least amongst what you would call like a middle class to upper middle class demographic, vendors that are targeting that demographic still being able to do well.
Now, still talking about the headwinds now, as a result of the pandemic, we've actually seen an acceleration in inflation rates and exchange rate pressures. So what strategies can you recommend for SMEs to actually weather the storm?
Absolutely. That's a really great question. I think that's a question and it's a really important question for any venture at any size doing business in Nigeria, right? If when you buy your goods, you're bringing them in at 360 or 380 naira. And then by the time the goods arrive, they clear through the ports, you're actually trying to sell them then at 440 or 460 naira. It's a really complicated process, but I think that some of this is about three things. One is research, right? So making sure that you're actually keeping a tab on all of the various macro and global geopolitical factors that have a potential to affect the economy, so that you're able to adjust quickly to that. The second thing is I think about having a dynamic pricing model that adjusts for some of this. I don't think it's easy to predict that you're going to see change from 360 naira to 480 at a point 500 naira, within a matter of weeks. But I think there is some hedging that you can do in your pricing that allows you to adjust for that. But I think the most important thing that MSMEs in particular need to solve for is having really, really sort of low cost structures. I think that as you build a business in an environment like this one, which has all kinds of challenges, political, infrastructural, socioeconomic, that you want to have your cost structure be as low cost as you possibly can. And you want to have a team and a setup that's as dynamic as possible.
Now, we've seen a lot of SMEs across the real sector having to downsize this period in a bid to actually save costs. But is that the only alternative to apply whenever there's a crisis of this nature?
Right. So the downsizing question. So I've actually seen some SMEs grow, not just downsize. And I think sometimes downsizing might not even be the solution. It might be restructuring, right? So you might have a venture that's not actually organized in the most efficient way possible. Perhaps you're not leveraging, your employees in the best way. And I think that one of the trends that I noticed with some businesses was that they use this as an opportunity to restructure their businesses. I think that sometimes for sociocultural reasons, you can't quite you wouldn't be able to make some dramatic changes in your personnel and in your staffing. But I think under the cover of the pandemic, a lot of business leaders, a lot of shrewd business leaders were able to really readjust their staffing and think carefully about, who do I really need on my team? Do I need to keep this person on my team? Do I need to, change the way that I'm using this person on my team? And I think that that's really going to account for some of the success that they're going to be able to see moving forward. And I think broadly speaking, venture leaders, entrepreneurs need to constantly be thinking about how it is that they're structuring and managing their businesses, right? Constantly asking yourself a question for a rapidly growing business. Is this the right way to be doing this? Is there a more efficient way to be doing this? And then, is the way that I'm doing this sustainable for building a long-term institution? Will I be here? Obviously, you have to take care of today. You have to make sure that you're making the decisions that allow you to survive the headwinds that we've been talking about. But you also have to make decisions that are good for you in the long term, right? So on a 5, 10, 15-year horizon.
Now, let's talk about the role of government. Now, what do you make of government policies that are geared towards economic stimulation in Nigeria?
I think they've been interesting. They've been a mixed bag. I think we've seen over the last, week or two, various kinds of responses to the government's economic decisions. I think that for a lot of these decisions are targeted, though not at MSMEs, which can be a good and a bad thing, right? So if you look at policies that are coming from CBN, and if you even look sometimes at some of the structures that are being put in place by even organizations that are thinking about small businesses like NIDA, what you find is that this decision-making is in particular targeted at MSMEs. What that means, I think, is that they can continue to fly under the radar and make choices that are going to work for their environment.
And now let's look at the issues of tax. Of course, authorities still demanded for taxes for the month of April, which was during the period of the total lockdown. And now that some of these SMEs only open partially, the taxes remain unchanged. How can these disconnects be resolved?
Absolutely. When it comes to taxation, for any business that's thinking about growth, so one of the points I was making earlier was the idea about making decisions that are going to allow you to survive today, but are also going to allow you to build a long-term institution, right? Taxation is one of those things that if you're doing business in any country, you have to build into your revenue modeling, you have to build into the sustainability of the business model. So really, one of the things that MSMEs should be doing is continuing to equip themselves with as much knowledge about, how to properly manage their taxes. Thankfully, there are lots of resources, both in terms of online, through the FIRS, if you're operating in Lagos through the LIRS, there's things like DIY law, there are consortiums that are really looking at how to ensure that leaders of MSMEs know how to manage their taxes. I know that it can be a bit confusing and it can feel quite overwhelming, but I've found that in general, right, if an MSME is thinking critically about the landscape that they're in and the fact that taxation is a matter of fact in this landscape, it's something that you avoid for too long and then it becomes a problem for you. That if they take the proactive steps to make sure that you're doing the right things, then it's less of a hassle for them in the long run.
Of course, the government is really scrambling for additional sources of income at this time. And the FIRS just announced some stamp duty charges, one of which is a 6% stamp duty on rent. What strategies can you give to operators to manage issues such as this?
Right. So again, this is a communication problem, right? So as I understand it, that the stamp duty and all of those sort of associated charges are pre-existing. They're not new. What has changed is really sort of the degree of enforcement, right? So the government sort of putting out notices because it's trying to increase its revenue and saying that, look, we're going to be enforcing much harder on this, particularly for an MSME that doesn't have, a great deal of infrastructure to fight troublesome clients or deal with trouble. I actually think that doing the right thing at the level of making sure that all of your documentation is stamped and has followed all due process is good for protection for you in the long run. And so the 6%, I believe, is not a flat rate that applies in all cases. There's actually a quite comprehensive listing of, what rate applies and when. And so again, it's really about relying on these resources to make sure that you're not, overpaying your taxes. It's hard to get a refund on that, but also making sure that you're not underpaying.
All right, so a lot of these headwinds will lead to cases of cost transfer to consumers and hike in pricing. So how can entrepreneurs better handle this, considering the decline in purchasing power of Nigerians?
Absolutely. I think this is a hard problem to solve because everyone's going to, be tightening their budget. People don't want to, spend willy-nilly as much because the economic pressures affect us all. I think really here the solution is about value creation. We're going to consume, by and large, those things that we think we need. And so the stronger argument that any sort of business leader can make about the value of their product and making sure that what it is that they're offering to a consumer is something that actually improves the quality of their lives or helps them to, navigate whatever present situation they're in, then you're going to see, that you're, despite the circumstances, that you're still thriving. Because that's really the question, right? Is value. When you're in a low resource environment, when you're dealing with scarcity, people start to try and make more intentional decisions about how it is that they're allocating their scarce resources. So entrepreneurs that are focusing on real value creation and not just taking advantage, I think are going to see a boom at this point.
Now, part of the challenges that SMEs would face this period perhaps is the fact that more of them have also defaulted on their loan obligations lately, and the CBN has just introduced the global standing instruction policy to debit defaulters' accounts in other banks to make up for those repayments. How would you react to this?
Right. So I don't think, as has been explained to me by some really intelligent lawyers, that is really targeted at MSMEs. I think it's really targeted at some of these really massive loans that have been quite difficult for banks to reclaim from, really bad debtors. That said, of course, is it possible that, based on the GSI update that MSMEs might be targeted? Yes, but the numbers that we're dealing with these ventures are so low, and the cost of actually implementing this GSI update make it fairly impractical for banks to be pursuing MSMEs. That's not to say that MSMEs should not do a better job of managing their debt. I think across board, whether you're looking at very large businesses or very small businesses, there is an unfortunate culture of bad debt. And so one of the things that leaders need to think about is better fiscal management policies, right? So if cash flow is a problem and that's what's making it difficult for you to, settle your loans on time, making sure that your creditors are happy with you, then you need to rethink the way that you're doing business, right? If that means bringing consultants in to help you, if that means sitting down with your team to re-strategize, if that means doing a better job of claiming payments from your customers, whatever a venture leader can do to ensure that they're actually a good debtor, I think is really, really important, because thinking long term about our landscape as we get more and more players in the space that are interested in credit, both at the microcredit level and then larger sums of money, the better habits, the better debt hygiene that these venture leaders take on, the better for them, particularly as they look to grow and scale into new markets.
We'd like to thank you, Kristen Wilson, co-founder at Spirit, for sharing some of your time with us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.